August 17, 1943. 27,000 feet above Regensburg, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler watched through his canopy as another B-17 Flying Fortress disintegrated under his cannon fire. The American bomber's right wing folded upward, torn away by 20mm shells, and the massive aircraft tumbled toward the Bavarian countryside trailing ribbons of flame and debris. His fifth heavy bomber destroyed. The fifth this month. Through his headset, Stigler heard the excited chatter of his squadron mates. More kills. More American bombers falling like wounded birds. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilots of Jägerschwader 27 had turned the Regensburg raid into a massacre. Of the 146 B-17s that had crossed into German airspace that morning, 24 would never return to England. The Americans called this mission part of Operation Double Strike, simultaneous raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt designed to cripple German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe called it target practice. Because the American heavy bombers, despite their bristling machine guns and defensive formations, flew completely alone. No Allied fighter could escort them this deep into Germany. And alone, they were helpless. What Franz Stigler didn't know, what none of the confident German fighter pilots knew, was that American engineers were already solving the range problem. Within 8 months, everything would change. The hunters would become the hunted. The laughter would become silence. And Franz Stigler himself would face a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mathematics of the air war in 1943 were brutally simple. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to defend itself. 10 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, strategically positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The theory seemed sound: put enough bombers in formation, concentrate their defensive firepower, and enemy fighters couldn't get through. American doctrine called it the combat box, 18 to 21 bombers arranged in a three-dimensional defensive pattern. In practice, German pilots had dissected every weakness. Major Egon Mayer of JG-2 had pioneered the head-on attack in late 1942, exploiting the B-17's vulnerable nose section. Most bomber gunners instinctively tracked targets, following the fighter across the sky with their guns. But a fighter approaching head-on at a combined closing speed of 500 miles per hour gave gunners less than 3 seconds in range. 3 seconds to overcome panic, acquire the target, and fire accurately. Most couldn't do it. Major Mayer had destroyed 25 heavy bombers using this tactic before his death in March 1944. The real problem wasn't tactics. It was range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, America's primary escort fighter in 1943, had a combat radius of 375 miles with drop tanks. Enough to reach the German border. Not enough to protect bombers attacking Schweinfurt, Regensburg, or targets deeper in the Reich. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning could fly further, but its Allison engines failed catastrophically in the frigid air above 25,000 feet. Supercharger regulators froze. Coolant lines burst. Engines quit without warning. This created what Luftwaffe pilots called the Reichsverteidigungszone, the Reich Defense Zone. A sanctuary beyond the range of Allied escorts where German fighters operated with impunity. They tracked incoming bomber streams on radar, calculated exactly where American escorts would turn back, and waited. The moment the little friends left, the slaughter began. Bomber crews knew what was coming. Some missions involved 4 hours over enemy territory with only 90 minutes of fighter protection. You could see the formations tighten when escorts turned for home. Gunners checked their ammunition. Pilots pushed throttles forward, trying to coax extra speed from engines already straining. Everyone scanned the sky for the first black dots of approaching German fighters. Then came October 14, 1943. The second Schweinfurt raid. Black Thursday. Mission 115 for the 8th Air Force. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses tasked with destroying the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The city produced 52% of Germany's anti-friction bearings, critical components for tanks, aircraft, submarines. Destroy Schweinfurt's factories, Allied planners believed, and German war production would collapse. The Luftwaffe committed over 300 fighters to the interception. They attacked in waves, company front formations of 8 FW-190s approaching line abreast, saturating the bomber's defensive fire with multiple simultaneous targets. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high. Side attacks exploiting blind spots. Tail attacks picking off stragglers. By the time the shattered formations limped back to England, 60 B-17s had been shot down. Another 17 crash-landed or were written off due to battle damage. 77 bombers lost. Over 600 airmen killed or captured. Some bomb groups lost 25% of their aircraft in a single day. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters. After Black Thursday, deep penetration raids were suspended. The loss rate was unsustainable. At this rate, bomber crews had a less than 25% chance of surviving a full 25 mission tour. The strategic bombing campaign, the centerpiece of American air strategy in Europe, was failing. German fighter pilots celebrated. Their tactics worked. Their courage held. Germany's skies remained German. What they didn't know was that the aircraft that would end their dominance had already made its first flight 3 years earlier. April 1940. Inglewood, California. North American Aviation Headquarters. The British Purchasing Commission had come to America desperate for fighters. The Royal Air Force was bleeding aircraft and pilots. France was collapsing. The Luftwaffe was growing stronger. Britain needed fighters immediately, anything that could fly and fight. The Commission approached North American Aviation requesting additional Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a counterproposal. Instead of building someone else's design, North American would create an entirely new fighter. From scratch. In 120 days. The British thought he was insane. Designing a combat aircraft typically took 2 to 3 years. Kindleberger promised 4 months. His chief designer, Edgar Schmud, a German immigrant who had fled the Nazis, went to work. Schmud had studied aerodynamics in Germany before emigrating to America in 1930. He understood something critical: drag was the enemy of range. Reduce drag, and every gallon of fuel carried you further. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940. From contract to first flight, 102 days. The British named it Mustang. Early models, powered by Allison V-1710 engines, excelled below 15,000 feet but struggled at altitude where bomber escort was needed. The RAF used them for low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. The Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and had exceptional range. But without high-altitude performance, it couldn't escort heavy bombers deep into Germany. The transformation came from an unlikely partnership. April 1942. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew an Allison-engined Mustang at Hucknall Airfield in England. Harker immediately recognized the airframe's potential. The Mustang was aerodynamically superior to the Spitfire: cleaner lines, less drag, better range. It just needed a better engine. Harker proposed marrying the American airframe with Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine. The Merlin 61 featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained power output above 30,000 feet. It was the same engine that powered the Spitfire Mark 9 and the high-altitude variants of the Lancaster bomber. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942. The results exceeded even optimistic predictions. Maximum speed increased from 390 to 442 miles per hour. Service ceiling jumped from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. Most importantly, combat radius with drop tanks extended to over 850 miles, enough to escort bombers anywhere in Germany and return to England. The marriage of American mass production capability with British engine technology created something neither nation could have achieved alone. The P-51 Mustang, called Cadillac of the Sky by its pilots, was about to change the air war forever. November 1943. Boxted Airfield, Essex, England. The 354th Fighter Group received the first P-51 BS. The 354th, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, was technically part of the 9th Air Force but was immediately attached to the 8th Air Force for bomber escort duty. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, had less than a week to convert his pilots from P-47 Thunderbolts to the unfamiliar fighter. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, operations officer for the 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the first evaluation flights. Years later, he recalled, "The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something extraordinary. The Mustang was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it felt like it could fly forever. We'd been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Suddenly, both hands were free." The first combat mission came on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over Belgium. The first long-range escort mission followed on December 13, Kiel, 490 miles from base. Previously impossible. The 16 P-51 BS encountered no enemy fighters, but the mission validated the aircraft's revolutionary range capability. December 20 brought the first combat claims, 3 Luftwaffe fighters shot down during an escort mission to Bremen. More significantly, the Mustangs had engaged German fighters deep inside Germany, territory that had been a sanctuary just weeks before. For German pilots, the initial encounters were confusing. At distance, the P-51B resembled the P-47 Thunderbolt. German controllers expected the American escorts to turn back at any moment, as they always had. But the silver fighters kept coming. Past the Normaltenbach point. Deeper into German airspace. Some German pilots thought they were misidentifying captured or rebuilt American aircraft. The alternative, that Allied fighters could now reach anywhere in Germany, was too dangerous to accept. Major Klaus Mittisch, commanding 3/JG-26, recognized the threat immediately after a December 30 interception. Mustangs had pursued his fighters all the way to the landing pattern at his own airfield. After landing, he gathered his pilots and delivered a stark message: the air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists. Not everyone believed him. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, refused to accept intelligence reports about long-range American fighters. When subordinates insisted that P-51s were appearing deep over Germany, Göring reportedly replied, "Impossible. No single-engine fighter can fly from England to central Germany. Your pilots are mistaken." The proof came on March 4, 1944. 25,000 feet above Brandenburg. Through scattered clouds, the sprawling outline of Berlin was clearly visible. The capital of the Third Reich. The city Hermann Göring had sworn would never see enemy aircraft. The political and psychological heart of Nazi Germany. Above it, in perfect formation, flew 660 American heavy bombers. And surrounding them, weaving protective patterns like silver guardian angels, were scores of single-engine fighters bearing American markings. The first American fighter escort to Berlin. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, led his 3 squadrons of P-51 BS on the historic 1,100-mile round trip. The 4th had received their Mustangs just 4 days earlier. Now they were accomplishing what German leadership had deemed impossible. For Luftwaffe pilots scrambling to intercept, the sight was incomprehensible. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Allied single-engine fighters couldn't reach Berlin. It was too far. Physically impossible. Every tactical assumption had been based on that impossibility. Yet there they were. Fresh and aggressive after flying 550 miles, while German defenders were already calculating fuel reserves after just taking off. The combat was savage. The Luftwaffe committed over 200 fighters. But they weren't facing exhausted bomber gunners, they were facing eager Mustang pilots with altitude advantage and superior aircraft. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 15 victories. More critically, dozens of German attacks on the bombers were broken up before they could press home. When the formations returned to England, bomber losses were significantly lower than previous deep penetration raids. The difference wasn't better defensive tactics or improved gunnery. The difference was the Mustang. In Berlin, Hermann Göring listened to the reports in silence. When confronted with gun camera footage clearly showing P-51s over the capital, he reportedly said nothing for several minutes. Then, almost to himself, "We have lost the air war." The strategic implications cascaded rapidly. Every assumption about Reich defense had been based on the sanctuary of distance. Training fields, aircraft assembly plants, and synthetic oil refineries had been located in central Germany specifically because they were thought safe from fighter attack. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issued new orders in January 1944. Previously, escort fighters were instructed to stay close to the bombers, maintaining defensive formations. Doolittle's new doctrine was aggressively offensive: escort the bombers to the target, but once bombs were dropped, go hunting. Seek out German fighters wherever they could be found. Dive to the deck. Strafe airfields. Catch German fighters during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The goal wasn't just protecting bombers. It was destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. February 20th to 25th, 1944, Operation Argument. Historians would call it Big Week. The 8th Air Force launched a coordinated campaign against German aircraft production. Over 6 days, American bombers flew 3,300 sorties with 3,673 fighter sorties in support. The bombers lost 226 aircraft, significant losses, but sustainable. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 fighters destroyed and, critically, irreplaceable pilots killed. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, later described the shift: the Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive. It transformed it. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. They brought the battle to us on their terms, whenever they wished, wherever they wished. The mathematics of attrition now favored the Allies overwhelmingly. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots. February, 2,121. March, 2,115. American losses, while significant, were replaced by massive training programs producing over 11,000 new pilots monthly. German veteran pilots, men with years of combat experience and hundreds of victories, were irreplaceable. Every loss degraded the Luftwaffe's effectiveness exponentially. An American pilot with 50 hours of combat experience was valuable but replaceable. A German pilot with 500 hours of combat experience was a strategic asset whose loss couldn't be compensated. The Mustang enabled a secondary campaign that would prove even more devastating than bombing factories: the systematic destruction of Germany's oil production. Synthetic oil plants at Luna, Politz, and Brucks, previously beyond escort range, now faced regular precision attacks with full fighter protection. Aviation fuel production collapsed. From 175,000 tons in April 1944 to 30,000 tons in July. By September 1944, production had fallen to just 10,000 tons monthly, barely 5% of requirements. The impact was catastrophic. Training flights were curtailed, then eliminated. New pilots arrived at combat units with as few as 40 hours total flight time, less time than it took to properly learn formation flying, let alone combat tactics. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-7, later wrote, "We had the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, capable of 540 miles per hour. But we could barely fuel them. I watched helplessly as dozens of these superb aircraft sat idle while Mustangs roamed freely overhead." June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion of Normandy. Allied planners expected the Luftwaffe to throw everything at the invasion beaches. The landings would be the most vulnerable moment, thousands of ships packed together, troops exposed on open beaches. German air power could inflict catastrophic casualties if concentrated properly. The Luftwaffe managed 319 sorties over France on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties. Only 2 German fighters appeared over the invasion beaches themselves. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wudersick, made a single strafing run along Sword Beach before fleeing. Priller later described the mission as suicide disguised as duty. They survived only because Allied fighters were too surprised by the lone pair of FW-190s to react effectively. The most important military operation of the war proceeded under virtually complete air supremacy. Mustangs and other Allied fighters had established such dominance that the invasion was essentially unopposed from the air. Behind the statistics lay human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group shot down a Bf-109 on March 8, 1944. He watched the German pilot bail out, parachute opening successfully. Then he saw flames. The pilot was on fire, trying desperately to beat out flames spreading across his flight suit as he descended. Wisner circled helplessly, watching a man burn to death in his parachute over 4 minutes. There was nothing anyone could do. German pilot Walter Schuck of JG-7 described the transformation. In 1943, we were confident warriors, masters of our own skies. By 1944, we were being hunted relentlessly. Mustangs would follow us to our own airfields, circle overhead while we tried to land on minimum fuel, then attack. There was no safety anywhere. Every takeoff might be your last. Every landing was a moment of terror. The psychological toll was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had been supremely confident in 1943 became increasingly fatalistic by mid-1944. One pilot's letter, intercepted by Allied intelligence, read, "We take off knowing most of us will not return. The Americans are everywhere. Always above us. Always with more fuel, more ammunition. We are not fighting an air force. We are fighting an industrial machine." By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's collapse was complete. The United States had produced 15,486 P-51 Mustangs. At peak strength in March 1945, the 8th Air Force alone operated over 1,000 Mustangs across 14 fighter groups. Against this, the Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 serviceable fighters on any given day, scattered across the entire Reich. Most never flew due to fuel shortages. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, ended the war with 24 aerial victories, all in Mustangs. He observed, by 1945, it wasn't combat. It was execution. We'd find German airfields, circle overhead, and shoot down anyone who tried to take off or land. The Mustang had made all of Germany a combat zone. Germany's technological response, the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, came too late with too few resources. The Me-262 was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51. In capable hands, it could devastate bomber formations. Adolf Galland, flying with JV-44 in 1945, shot down 7 aircraft in the jet. But he recognized the futility. We were like a few tigers facing hundreds of wolves. For every Me-262, the Americans had 50 Mustangs. And Mustangs could loiter over our airfields, attacking jets when they were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down 2 Me-262s on October 7, 1944, by catching them in the landing pattern. The jets, low on fuel with throttles reduced for landing, were helpless against diving Mustangs. After the war, the survivors gathered to remember. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, American and German fighter pilots met at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas. Former enemies, now elderly men, shared stories and respect across what had once been an impassable divide. Colonel Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs with 16 victories, sat across from Gustav Rodel, Germany's third highest scoring ace. Rodel raised his glass to the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war. We had excellent aircraft, superb pilots, and were fighting over our own homeland. But you had the Mustang. And that made all the difference. Walter Schuck, who had transitioned from FW-190s to Me-262 jets, added, "We went from laughing at unescorted bombers to taking cover from Mustangs in 4 months. No military force has ever experienced such a complete reversal." General Johannes Steinhoff, his face still bearing scars from his Me-262 crash in April 1945, reflected, "You ask when we knew the war was lost. It was March 4, 1944. The day we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost." Franz Stigler, the Bf-109 pilot who had watched B-17s fall over Regensburg in August 1943, attended the reunion. He spoke little about his wartime experiences but said this, "We laughed at your bombers because we could not imagine America producing a fighter with the range to escort them to Berlin. We underestimated your engineers, your industry, and your determination." The P-51 Mustang taught us the cost of underestimating one's enemies. The P-51 Mustang's final statistics tell the story: 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat over Europe. 4,131 destroyed on the ground. An 11-to-1 kill-to-loss ratio. 213,873 combat sorties. Over 1.3 million combat hours. But the true impact can't be measured in numbers. The Mustang broke the Luftwaffe's will to fight, enabled the invasion of Europe, and shortened the war by months. The transformation was catastrophic. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe controlled German skies, shooting down bombers at will. By March 1944, Mustangs escorted bombers to Berlin. By June 1944, only 2 German fighters appeared over D-Day. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. This wasn't gradual decline. It was collapse. Each lost pilot couldn't be replaced. Each destroyed aircraft reduced training capability. Each successful escort mission emboldened Allied planners to strike deeper and harder. The Mustang proved that in modern industrial warfare, courage and skill, while necessary, are not sufficient. Victory belongs to those who can produce the most, train the best, and innovate the fastest. It shattered the myth of German technological superiority and demonstrated that democratic societies, when unified, can outproduce and out-innovate authoritarian regimes. Perhaps the Mustang's greatest achievement was psychological. It destroyed the myth of invincibility. German pilots indoctrinated in Nazi ideology experienced profound cognitive dissonance when confronting American material superiority. Everything they had been taught about racial superiority, about German technical prowess, about American weakness, all contradicted by the elegant silver fighter that dominated their homeland skies. The German pilots who laughed in October 1943 learned by March 1944 that they had laughed too soon. Their confidence, based on reasonable tactical assessment, became their greatest vulnerability. They failed to anticipate American problem-solving capability, the marriage of international technologies, and democratic industrial capacity. The laughter that echoed over Regensburg and Schweinfurt in 1943 became silence by 1944. The P-51 Mustang had written its name across the skies of Europe in contrails and cordite. The fighter that ended the Luftwaffe's dominance. The weapon that gave America air supremacy. The aircraft that proved range could be a weapon as decisive as speed or firepower. 79 years later, the lesson endures: never underestimate an enemy's capacity for innovation. Never assume today's advantage is permanent. And never laugh too soon, because the aircraft that silences your laughter may already be in production, waiting for its moment to change everything. The transformation was complete. Irreversible. Devastating. From German triumph to American dominance in 4 months. From turkey shoot to hunted prey. From laughter to silence. The P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war over Europe.